The cold was the first thing Lyen Ashfall felt before he even opened his eyes. It pressed against his back through the stone floor, crept up his spine, settled into his shoulders like something that had been waiting there a long time. His fingers were numb. His wrists ached. And when he finally pulled his eyelids open and looked up at the ceiling above him, all he saw was dark gray stone and the faint orange flicker of a single torch burning somewhere to his left. He did not know where he was. He did not know how he had gotten there. He did not know what time it was, what day it was, or how long he had been lying on that floor. His body felt like it had been carried a great distance and set down without care, his limbs heavy and strange, his mind wrapped in something thick and slow that made every thought feel like it was arriving from very far away. Lyen sat up carefully. The chains on his wrists clinked. He looked down at them. Iron. Old but solid. Connected to a ring in the wall by a length of heavy links that gave him just enough reach to sit upright but not enough to stand fully. He stared at those chains for a long time the way a person stares at something that makes no sense at all, hoping that if he looks long enough the explanation will simply appear. No explanation came. The last thing he remembered was the afternoon light coming through the tall windows of Soren's private study. He remembered setting down the finished map case, the leather one with the brass clasps that Soren had given him on his first day as an apprentice. He remembered Soren smiling at him across the desk, warm and steady the way Soren always was, and saying the words Lyen had been waiting 3 months to hear. He said the maps were perfect. He said Lyen had outdone himself. He said he was proud. And then there was nothing. Just black, and then cold, and then the ceiling of this dungeon. Lyen breathed slowly and told himself not to panic. Panic would not help him understand anything. Panic was just noise that drowned out the parts of his mind that might actually be useful. He looked around the space he was in. It was a cell, clearly, but a large one compared to what he had always imagined dungeons to look like. The walls were thick stone, the floor swept clean of obvious filth, the torch mounted in a proper iron bracket outside the cell bars rather than inside. There was a small barred window set high in the far wall. Through it he could see a strip of dark sky. Not even pale gray, fully black. So it was night, and late night at that. He was underground, or close to it. He was somewhere built to hold people and built well. He was somewhere he very much did not want to be. The sound of boots on stone came before he saw anyone. Measured steps. Not rushing, not cautious. The kind of walk that belongs to someone who has never once in their life needed to hurry because everything they move toward already knows to wait for them. Lyen turned toward the cell door. The man who appeared on the other side of the bars was not what he expected, though Lyen could not have said exactly what he expected. He was tall in the way that fills a doorway without trying. Dark hair, cut short and practical. A jaw that looked like it had been drawn by someone who did not believe in softness. He was in a general's coat, deep navy blue with silver rank markings at the shoulder, but the coat was open at the collar and one of his sleeves was rolled back to the elbow as though he had come from work and not yet had time to fully compose himself. His eyes were pale. Not blue, not gray, somewhere between the two, the color of winter light on ice. He looked at Lyen the way a person looks at something that used to mean something to them and no longer does. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You're awake, little traitor." Lyen opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "I am sorry," he said carefully, because his voice came out quieter than he meant it to and he wanted to sound steadier than he felt, "but I do not know who you are or why I am here." The general tilted his head slightly. It was not a warm movement. It was the movement of someone filing information away. "General Kael Dravos," he said. "Commander of the northern armies of this kingdom. And you are here because you are a traitor, as I just said." "I am not a traitor." Kael Dravos looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then he reached through the bars and set something down on the stone floor just inside the cell. A leather case. Flat, rectangular, with brass clasps. It was Lyen's map case. Lyen stared at it. Something cold that had nothing to do with the dungeon floor moved through him. Kael said, "Those maps were delivered to Commander Essa of the enemy's Eastern Division 11 days ago. They show every mountain pass through the northern range. Every patrol route. Every supply line and its timing. Whoever drew those maps gave the enemy everything they needed to move 300 soldiers through our blind spots without a single one of our border posts knowing until it was too late." He paused. The pause was deliberate. 22 of my soldiers were ambushed. 3 of them did not survive. Lyen heard that number and felt it land somewhere deep inside him where it would stay for a very long time. "I drew those maps," he said slowly, because he needed to be honest even when honesty felt like stepping onto ice. "I drew them for Master Soren's private archive. The Northern Range Survey. He commissioned them 3 months ago and I finished them last week." "We know who commissioned them," Kael said. "We know who drew them. Your seal is on every sheet. Your handwriting is on the index. Then you also know I gave them to Soren Vale. Not to anyone else. Not to any courier, not to any buyer, not to any enemy commander. I gave them to my mentor." Kael said nothing. "I did not send those maps across the border," Lyen said, and his voice was steady, steadier than he felt, steadier than any part of him had a right to be while sitting chained to a dungeon wall. "I do not know anyone in the Eastern Division. I have never left this kingdom. I do not know anyone on the other side of the Northern Range at all." Kael looked at him for a long time. His expression did not change. Whatever he was thinking did not show on his face in any way that Lyen could read. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor the way he had come, and the sound of his boots faded, and Lyen was alone again with the cold and the chains and the case full of maps that had destroyed everything. He did not sleep well that night. He lay on the floor and looked at the strip of sky through the high window and thought about Soren Vale. About the way Soren had taught him to measure distances using the width of a thumb at arm's length. About the way Soren kept a kettle on the corner of his desk and always poured Lyen a cup without asking. About the way Soren had said he was proud of him, that very last afternoon, smiling across the desk with warmth that felt completely real. It had been real to Lyen. Every single moment of it. The morning brought bread and water delivered by a young soldier who would not meet Lyen's eyes. Lyen ate without tasting anything and sat near the small window and let the pale morning light fall across his hands. He studied his own palms the way he had always studied maps, looking for detail, looking for the truth of a place in the shapes it made. He had drawn hundreds of maps in his 19 years. Mountain passes, river systems, coastal edges, trade routes through forest and farmland. He had loved every one of them. He had never once imagined that his love for that work could be picked up and used like a weapon against people who had nothing to do with him at all. 3 soldiers. 3 people who went somewhere because a map told them the way was clear and did not come home because the map was a lie by the time it got there. He did not cry. Not because he was not sad enough to. Because the sadness was too big for tears. It sat in his chest like a stone and he breathed around it and tried to think. Kael Dravos came back that evening. He pulled a chair from somewhere outside the cell and sat on the other side of the bars, which Lyen had not expected at all. He set down a lit lantern on the floor between them, pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat, and looked at it for a moment before he looked at Lyen. "Walk me through it," he said. "From the beginning. How the commission started." Lyen looked at him carefully. This was not an interrogation with threat in it, or not only that. This was something else. Kael Dravos was asking him to talk in the way a person asks when they want to hear the gaps between the words. So Lyen talked. He told Kael about the day Soren had come to him with the commission, 3 months before. How Soren had explained that he was compiling a private geographic archive for his own research into northern trade expansion. How the maps needed to be done in Lyen's specific style, detailed and precise, because Soren had always said Lyen's precision was the best he had seen in a student in 20 years. How Lyen had worked on them every day for 3 months, checking and rechecking every measurement, because he wanted them to be perfect. Because Soren had said he was proud of him, and Lyen had wanted, more than he could easily admit, to deserve that. Kael listened without interrupting. His pale eyes moved over Lyen's face in a way that felt less like suspicion and more like reading. Like Lyen was a map himself, and Kael was memorizing the shape of things. When Lyen finished, Kael folded his paper and put it back in his coat. He sat still for a moment. Then he said, "The seal on the maps. Did Soren have access to it?" Lyen felt something shift in his chest. The question was precise. Too precise to be accidental. "Yes," he said quietly. "He gave it to me. It lives in a drawer in his study. He has a key to that drawer. I have a key to that drawer." Kael said nothing else that evening. He took his lantern and his chair and left. But he did not send anyone to put the chains back on. Lyen sat in the growing dark and understood something that had been trying to reach him since the moment he first opened his eyes in this place. Soren Vale had taken everything Lyen made with love and used it to cause a harm so large and real that 3 families had empty seats at their tables. And he had walked away. He had taken Lyen's name, Lyen's seal, Lyen's 3 months of careful devoted work, signed his own crime with them, and walked away into his countryside life without a single backward look. The cold in the dungeon had not changed. But the cold inside Lyen was different now, quieter and harder, not the cold of fear. The cold of someone who finally understands exactly what was done to them and has decided, carefully and completely, that it will not be the end of their story. He pressed his back against the wall and looked at the strip of sky going slowly from black to the deep blue of very early morning. He breathed steadily. He waited for what would come next, because something was coming. He could feel it in the way Kael Dravos asked questions, in the careful space the general kept leaving open, as though he already suspected the answers and was simply waiting for the words to confirm what his instincts had been telling him all along. Lyen did not know yet what Kael Dravos was. He did not know if he was an ally or another door that would close on him in the dark. But he knew the man was paying attention in a way that nobody else had. And right now, in a dungeon at the bottom of a cold stone building with his name on evidence he did not create, that was the only thing that felt, however distantly and uncertainly, like something worth holding on to. Nobody told Lyen he was being moved. He simply woke up one morning to the sound of the cell door opening and found a young soldier standing there with no chains in his hands and no explanation on his face, only a quiet instruction to follow. Lyen followed. He had no reason not to. He had nowhere to run to and nothing waiting for him on the outside that would not crumble the moment he showed his face, not with his name still attached to a treason charge and his mentor living free in the countryside. The soldier led him up 2 flights of stone stairs, through a heavy door, and down a corridor that smelled of wood polish and cold morning air. At the end of that corridor was a room. Small, stone-walled like everything else in this garrison, but above ground. There was a narrow bed with a folded blanket at the foot of it. There was a writing table and a chair. And there was a window, a real window, not a high slit barely wide enough to show a strip of sky but an actual window with a latch and a ledge wide enough to sit on, looking out over the sloping hills that rolled away from the garrison walls into pale morning mist. Lyen stood in the middle of that room for a long moment and simply looked at the window. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed and breathed. He did not see Kael Dravos that day. Or the next. Meals arrived at the same times each day, brought by the same quiet soldier, and no one came to question him or instruct him or remind him of what he was accused of. The door was not locked, he checked, carefully, the first evening, pressing the latch with a single finger and feeling it give. But 2 guards stood in the corridor outside at all hours and he had no illusions about what would happen if he simply tried to walk out of the building. He was not free. He was simply somewhere more bearable than before. He spent the first 3 days sitting at the writing table doing nothing. His mind kept reaching for work, for the familiar shape of a commission, the clean pleasure of plotting a scale and building a picture from measurements and memory, and finding nothing to hold on to. He had no tools. No paper. No charcoal. Just his hands folded on the table in front of him and the window full of hills and the slow, grinding work of trying to understand what his life had become. On the 4th day, Theo Rast appeared in his doorway. Lyen had seen the commander before, briefly, passing in the corridor below the dungeon during one of Kael's evening visits. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with an open face and dark eyes that moved quickly and quietly over everything in any room he entered. He was not loud. He had the particular stillness of someone who was very comfortable in their own skin and had no need to fill spaces with noise. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at Lyen with an expression that was not quite friendly and not quite suspicious. Somewhere between the two. The expression of a person doing their own quiet calculation. He said, "You look bored." Lyen said, "I am bored." Theo considered this. Then he reached into his coat, produced a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and set it on the writing table. He left without another word. Lyen unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small stack of plain paper, a stick of black charcoal, and a pencil worn down to a comfortable length. He stared at them for a moment. Then he picked up the charcoal and turned to the window and for the first time in weeks, drew the shape of the hills exactly as they appeared through the glass, every slope and shadow and rolling edge, because it was what his hands knew how to do and because it was the only honest thing he could think of. He felt something loosen in his chest while he drew. Not dissolve. Not disappear. Just shift slightly, the way a knot does not untie itself in a moment but can be worked at, carefully, until it is less tight than it was. Kael came that evening. He came without warning as he always did, appearing in the doorway in his open coat with his sleeves already rolled, and this time he stopped when he saw the drawing spread across the writing table. He looked at it for a moment. His expression did not change, not exactly, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted, something behind those pale eyes that Lyen could not name yet. He sat down in the chair across the table and looked at the drawing and then looked at Lyen. "The hills outside the east wall," he said. "Yes," Lyen said. "You measured the proportions correctly." "I always measure correctly." Kael looked at him and something moved across his face that might, in another person, have been the beginning of a smile. It did not fully arrive but it was present, briefly, in the way his expression softened by the smallest possible degree before it composed itself again. He said, "Tell me how you learned cartography." It was not a question about the maps or the treason charge or Soren Vale. It was a different kind of question entirely, the kind that has no strategic purpose, the kind people only ask when they want to know. Lyen told him. He told him about being 12 years old and finding his father's old surveying tools in a box under the stairs of their small house in the lower city. About teaching himself to use a compass by copying the shapes of the streets outside his window. About saving 3 months of errand wages to buy a second-hand cartography text from a market stall, a book with half its pages water-damaged and one entire chapter missing, and reading the remaining pages so many times that he had memorized every sentence. About the day he was 17 and walked into Soren Vale's studio and asked, without an appointment and with no credentials except the maps he had drawn himself, whether there was any kind of position he might fill. Soren had looked at his maps for a long time. Then he had looked at Lyen. And then he had pulled out a chair and said, "Sit down." Lyen stopped talking. The memory had arrived somewhere he had not meant to take it. Kael watched him. "You trusted him completely," he said. It was not phrased as a question. "He was the only person who looked at something I made and took it seriously," Lyen said. "When you are 19 and you have been making things alone your whole life and someone with real knowledge and real standing looks at your work and says it is good, you give that person a great deal of trust. More than you should, probably. More than is wise." He paused. "I did not know at the time that there was such a thing as too much trust. I thought trust was something you gave fully or you did not give at all." Kael was quiet for a moment. "And now?" Lyen looked at his own hands. "Now I think trust is something you build the way you build a map. One measurement at a time. You do not draw the whole territory before you have walked it." Kael said nothing. But he stayed longer that evening than he had stayed any evening before. This became the pattern of the days that followed. Theo appearing occasionally with small practical things, an extra blanket one week, a better pencil the next, always without ceremony and always without lingering. Kael appearing each evening and sitting across the table and asking questions that moved further and further from the case and closer to the person. Lyen answering. Lyen asking back, because at some point it stopped feeling one-sided and started feeling like a conversation, and a conversation has two speakers. He learned things about Kael in small portions, the way a territory reveals itself when you are patient enough to walk it instead of trying to see it all at once from a distance. He learned that Kael had taken his first command at 21, younger than anyone in the Northern Army's history. That he had grown up in a garrison town 2 days' ride from the capital and had never known his mother. That he did not eat at the officers' table most evenings because he found large group meals exhausting in a way he did not fully explain, but that Lyen understood precisely without needing the explanation. He learned that Kael had a habit of arriving in the doorway and pausing for just a moment before entering, as though checking that the room was still what he expected. He learned that Kael's hands moved when he was thinking hard about something, a small unconscious turn of the wrist, barely visible unless you were watching closely. He learned that the cold in Kael's eyes was not the cold of a person who did not feel things. It was the cold of a person who felt things very much and had spent a long time building a quiet room around that feeling so it did not run everything. Lyen was watching closely. He was aware that he was watching closely. He was also aware that it was probably not the most sensible thing he had ever done, and that awareness did not stop him at all. 3 weeks in, Theo knocked on the doorframe one afternoon and told Lyen, in the same dry tone he used for everything, that Soren Vale had quietly sold his town property the same week Lyen was arrested and moved everything he owned to a rural estate 3 provinces away. That the enemy courier who had carried the maps across the border had last been seen departing from the capital's western gate, not from the northern border where he should have been if the transaction had happened there. That someone with connections to the royal court had filed a request to have Lyen's tribunal date moved forward by 6 weeks, and the request had been made before the investigation was even formally opened. Theo said all of this without expression and then left, and Lyen sat with it for the rest of the afternoon. Someone had wanted him convicted quickly. Someone with court connections. Someone who needed the story to close before anyone looked too hard at the parts that did not make sense. He was still sitting with it when Kael arrived that evening, and for the first time Kael came in and stopped when he saw Lyen's face. Not the drawing on the table, not the room. Lyen's face. He sat down without being asked. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that cost him something to say. Lyen could tell by the very slight change in his breathing, the smallest tension in his jaw, the way a person looks when they are doing something difficult and have decided to do it anyway. He said, 3 soldiers. Their names were Burin, Cho, and Alice. Burin had a wife and a daughter who is 4 years old. Cho was saving to bring his mother from the South Province. Alice had been in my unit for 6 years and could make the worst coffee you have ever tasted in your life and did so every single morning, and I never once told him to stop. He stopped. He looked at the table, not at Lyen. I have carried them every day since, he said. I will carry them for the rest of my life. That weight does not go away. He looked up. His pale eyes were steady and very clear. I do not believe you put it there. The room was very still. Lyen felt something happen inside his chest that he did not have a name for yet. Not happiness, it was too fragile and too weighted for happiness. Not relief, it was too warm for relief. It was something that lived between the two, something that had to do with being seen accurately by someone who had every reason to look away. It cracked open a part of him that had sealed itself shut when he woke up on the dungeon floor, and behind it was not weakness. Behind it was something small and green and alive that had somehow survived everything that had been done to his name and his work and his trust. He said, quietly and carefully, "Thank you for telling me their names." Kael nodded once. He did not speak again that evening. But when he left, he paused in the doorway the way he always did, and this time when he looked back at Lyen, the look lasted longer than it ever had before. Lyen watched him go and then turned to his drawing on the table. He picked up the charcoal and added the last shadow he had been leaving unfinished for days, the deep fold of darkness where the furthest hill curved away from the light. He pressed it in carefully, exactly right, the way you finish something only when you are sure the shape of it is true. The hills outside the window had not changed. The mist still rolled in at dusk. The morning still came pale and quiet and steady. But inside the small stone room above ground, something had shifted permanently in the direction of something better, and Lyen, for the first time since he woke up in chains, did not feel entirely alone inside the change. Theo did not knock that morning. He simply walked in, set a folded document on the writing table in front of Lyen, and stood back with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that was somewhere between satisfaction and the careful stillness of a man who has been working very hard towards something and has just watched it arrive. Lyen looked at the document. Then he looked at Theo. Then he picked it up and read it, slowly, from the first line to the last, because it was the kind of document that deserved to be read slowly. It was the kind of document that changed the shape of things. It was a full investigative record. 31 pages of dates, names, payments, witness accounts, courier logs, border crossing records, and signed testimony from 2 members of Soren Vale's own household staff who had been quietly interviewed over the past 4 weeks without Soren knowing. It was meticulous. It was thorough. It was the kind of work that could only be done by someone who was not simply trying to close a case but trying to get the truth down so completely that no one could ever argue it away. At the center of every page, connecting every line of evidence the way a river connects the places it passes through, were 2 names. Soren Vale. And Prince Aldrich Voss. Lyen set the document down very carefully on the table. His hands were steady. He was surprised to find that they were steady, because the inside of his chest felt like weather. Theo said, "The payment records go back 8 months. Long before your commission started. Aldrich needed the northern border weakened before the winter treaty talks. He needed it to look like an intelligence failure, not a deliberate act, so that the northern commanders would be put on the defensive and he could push his agenda through while they were managing the fallout. Soren was paid very well. The estate in the countryside was purchased with the second payment." He paused. "You were chosen because you were young, unconnected, and because your work was accurate enough to be genuinely useful. You were the best tool available and the easiest one to discard." The word tool sat in the room for a moment. Lyen had thought it himself, in the dungeon, in those first terrible hours of understanding. Hearing it spoken plainly by someone else made it land differently. Not heavier. More real. "Where is Kael?" Lyen asked. "With the king," Theo said. "He left before dawn." Lyen nodded slowly. He looked at the document again. 23 pages of Soren Vale's careful betrayal, laid out in ink and dates and amounts received. 3 families with empty seats at their tables. 1 19-year-old who woke up in chains and lost, in a single night, every certainty he had built his life around. And Kael Dravos had gone to the king before dawn with 31 pages of the truth. Lyen picked up his charcoal. He turned to the blank paper Theo had brought him 2 weeks ago, the last sheet in the stack, and he began to draw. Not the hills this time. He drew the northern range from memory, every pass and ridge and shadow, the way he had drawn it during the 3 months of his commission, but this time he drew it for himself. No seal. No commission. No name at the bottom but his own. He drew it because it was his. His knowledge, his precision, his months of careful work. Soren had taken the product of that work and turned it into something harmful and then put Lyen's name on the harm. But the knowledge itself, the ability, the love of the craft, none of that had ever belonged to Soren. It had always been Lyen's and it still was, and no document in any court anywhere could change that. He finished the drawing just before midday. It was the best map he had ever made. Kael returned in the late afternoon. Lyen heard the particular sound of his boots in the corridor before he appeared in the doorway, and something in Lyen's body recognized that sound and settled at it, which was an interesting thing to notice and which he noticed without pretending he had not. Kael looked at him. His coat was fully fastened, his posture as composed as always, but there was something different in his face today. Not open, exactly. Kael's face was never fully open. But the room he kept around himself, the quiet sealed space he maintained between his interior and the rest of the world, had a door in it today that had not been visible before. Something had shifted in the set of his jaw and the quality of his eyes, something that felt, when Lyen looked at it, like a decision made and settled. He said, "The king has the full investigative record. Royal warrants have been drawn for Soren Vale and for Prince Aldrich Voss. Your tribunal date has been suspended. The treason charge against you is under formal review pending the completion of the royal inquiry." He paused. That is the legal language. What it means plainly is that this is ending the right way. Lyen let the words settle over him. He had imagined this moment, in the dungeon and in the room above ground, in the early mornings before the mist cleared and the late evenings after Kael left. He had imagined it many times. He had not imagined that when it came it would feel this quiet. Not small. Just quiet. Like the moment after a very long storm when the rain stops and everything is still and wet and the world has rearranged itself slightly and you are standing in it, whole, breathing. He said, "How much trouble did it cost you? Going to the king before the inquiry was closed." Kael looked at him for a moment. "Some," he said. "Less than leaving it would have." Lyen understood what that meant. Kael had put his name and his rank and his reputation behind a 19-year-old mapmaker's apprentice that the court had already decided was guilty and convenient to be guilty. He had done it because the evidence pointed where it pointed and because Kael Dravos, underneath everything that made him terrifying to armies and impossible to read at banquets, was a person who could not leave a wrong thing wrong when he had the means to correct it. Lyen thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." Kael said, "Don't. I am going to anyway." Something crossed Kael's face. It was brief and warm and gone quickly. But Lyen had been watching this man closely for weeks and he caught it before it disappeared and held on to what he had seen. 3 days later, Soren Vale was arrested at his countryside estate. Theo told Lyen about it without decoration or drama, the way Theo told him everything. He said Soren had not resisted. Had not even looked surprised, exactly. Had simply stood in the doorway of his new estate and looked at the soldiers and then looked at the arrest warrant and then very quietly put on his coat and come with them. Theo said it with the tone of someone who found the absence of resistance more damning than a struggle would have been, as though Soren had been carrying the expectation of this moment long enough that it had worn a groove in him. Lyen did not feel satisfaction when he heard it. He had expected to. He had spent enough hours in the dark imagining this moment that he had assumed some form of satisfaction would be the natural result of it arriving. Instead he felt something graver and quieter than that. Something that had more to do with Burin and Cho and Alice than with himself. Something that was less about winning and more about the weight of what should never have happened being named properly at last. Prince Aldrich Voss attempted to leave the capital 4 days after the warrants were drawn. He was stopped at the Eastern Road checkpoint by 2 of Theo's riders who had been positioned there before the warrants were even signed, because Theo had anticipated exactly this and because Theo, under his dry manner and his plain speech, was one of the most quietly formidable people Lyen had ever been in a building with. The prince was brought back to the capital in a closed carriage and taken not to the palace but to a holding location run by the royal court investigators, which was a significantly less comfortable place than the room Lyen had been given above ground in Kael's garrison, and considerably more than Aldrich deserved by way of comfort. The royal inquiry took 11 days to complete its formal documentation. On the 12th day, a rider arrived at the garrison with a sealed letter bearing the royal court's mark. Theo brought it to Lyen directly and stood in the doorway while Lyen opened it and read it, watching with his arms crossed and his quiet, quick eyes steady. The letter formally withdrew the treason charge against Lyen Ashfall. It formally acknowledged that the evidence against him had been fabricated and that the maps bearing his seal had been transmitted to enemy forces by Soren Vale under commission from Prince Aldrich Voss. It formally restored his standing as a private citizen of the kingdom. At the bottom of the letter, in language that was dry and procedural and meant the world anyway, it stated that any professional records bearing his name in connection with the treason charge were to be struck and that his status as a cartographer was unimpeached. Lyen read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it on the table beside the map he had drawn of the northern range. He looked at both of them for a long moment. The formal letter of the kingdom restoring his name. The map he had drawn for himself alone, from memory and love and the stubbornness of a person who refused to let a stolen thing stay stolen. He thought they looked right together. The tribunal that followed was not the rushed, quietly managed affair that someone with court connections had tried to arrange 6 weeks before. It was formal and documented and public in the way that powerful people being held to account are made uncomfortable by. Soren Vale stood before the court and heard the evidence and could not answer it. Prince Aldrich stood and tried, twice, to redirect the narrative toward a version of events that served him, and both times was stopped by the weight of Theo's documentation, which was the kind of evidence that did not flex under pressure because it had been built specifically to withstand it. Lyen was called to speak. He did not shout. He did not break down. He stood in front of the court and told the truth in a clear voice, every detail from the first day of the commission to the morning he woke up on the dungeon floor, and he looked at the faces of the people listening and felt them shift, one by one, from the comfortable assumption of his guilt towards something more honest and less comfortable and true. Soren lost his position at the Royal Academy of Mapmakers. His name was removed from every professional record and replaced with a notation that would follow him wherever he went. Prince Aldrich lost his seat at the treaty negotiation table permanently and was removed from his court position pending further inquiry into his broader conduct. It was not a perfect ending in the way that stories sometimes promise endings to be. The 3 soldiers were still gone. That fact did not change and would not change. Lyen understood that the court process could not give back what had been taken from those 3 families, and he did not pretend to himself that it could. But the lie had been pulled out by its roots, slowly and completely, and the ground where it had been planted was clear now, and what grew back from clear ground was the truth, and the truth was that Lyen Ashfall had done nothing wrong. That mattered. It mattered in a way that settled something essential all the way down to the base of him. He found Kael on the roof of the northern garrison at dusk, the evening after the tribunal closed. He did not know how he knew Kael would be there. He simply knew, the way you know the shape of a place you have been paying careful attention to for long enough. He climbed the stairs and pushed open the roof door and found Kael standing at the far edge looking out at the hills, his coat open at the collar again, his hands loose at his sides, the setting sun making the ice of his eyes look, for once, golden. Lyen crossed the roof and stood beside him. They were quiet for a while. The kind of quiet that does not need to be filled. The hills rolled away from the garrison walls in the long amber light, and the mist was beginning to gather in the lower places, and everything smelled of stone and evening grass and something clean that Lyen could not name but that felt like relief made into air. Kael said, without looking at him, "Little traitor." Lyen turned his head. He looked at Kael's profile, the precise jaw, the pale eyes catching gold, the small tension at the corner of his mouth that Lyen now knew was the thing that happened right before something almost became a smile. He said, "That does not apply anymore." Kael turned and looked at him. The full weight of those pale eyes, present and warm and entirely unguarded in a way that Lyen had never seen from him in daylight. Kael said, very quietly, "I know. I have been trying to think of a better one." Lyen reached into his coat. He drew out the map he had made of the northern range, the one he had drawn for himself on the last sheet of paper, and he turned it over. On the back, in small careful handwriting that was the same handwriting that appeared on every map he had ever made, he had written a list. 12 names. 12 places he had drawn over the years but never visited, river towns and coastal cliffs and a forest in the eastern province that he had always imagined was exactly the green that the word forest should mean. He held it out to Kael. Kael took it. He looked at the list for a long moment, reading every name, taking his time the way he took his time with everything that mattered. Then he looked up at Lyen. He said, "I know 3 of these. I have been to 2 of them." Lyen felt warmth move through his chest, unhurried and certain, the kind of warmth that does not arrive in a rush because it does not need to, because it already knows it is staying. He said, "We could start with the closest one." Kael looked at him. The almost smile arrived fully this time, quiet and real and entirely his, and it changed his face into something that Lyen wanted to look at for a very long time. Kael folded the map carefully and put it in his coat, close. The sun finished setting. The mist filled the low places between the hills. The garrison behind them was full of the ordinary sounds of evening, soldiers changing watch, somewhere a door closing, somewhere a fire being lit. The world was going on around them the way the world does, full of its noise and its motion and its business. And on the roof of the northern garrison, two people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and built something true out of questions and drawings and evenings spent across a table stood side by side in the dusk, and neither of them moved away, and neither of them needed to. This was not the end of anything. It was better than that. It was the kind of beginning that feels, when it arrives, like something you did not know you had been waiting for until it was already there, quiet and solid and entirely, completely yours. If this story found its way into your heart, you are already one of us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new BL romance. A brand new story is waiting for you every single week, and the next one might just be your favorite yet.